Hello and welcome to another Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I'm really thrilled today to have my first mystery author joining me from the UK. I would love to tell you guys a little bit more about this book, but I'm going to let him go ahead and introduce himself and what we'll be talking about today.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, my name's Mike Hollow and I am the author of the Blitz Detective stories. And this is a series of detective mysteries. The latest one is coming out soon. It's called The Pimlico Murder, and I've got a copy here. There we are.
Wonderful. I love the covers for it. It was the first thing that really caught my eye. And then of course I live in London, so Pimlico jumped out as well as a place that I know well. So I was very curious when I picked this up and delighted to find stories really set in the Blitz and really just intricately researched. It was it's a fascinating story that you've got here, and I would love to hear a little bit more about it. So perhaps you can situate us where we find your detective at this point in your series.
Yeah, well, as you say, it's set in Pimlico, which is part of southwest London. And it's actually, I mean, in terms of familiarity with the place, one of the challenges of writing it was that I was doing a lot of the writing during the lockdown period.
Yes.
COVID pandemic, and so I couldn't really even get on the train to London, which is maybe 45 minutes on the train. I had to do so much research without being there, and it made it unusual in the sense that when I finally got there, I felt as if I'd lived there. I mean, I was looking around saying, "Oh, I know this place, I know that place," but it is set in southwest London, and it's an area which nowadays is quite expensive, because it has very nice Regency architecture built mainly in the early 19th century. But back in 1940, when the book is set, it was quite a rundown area, very neglected, a lot of a lot of poverty, and the architecture that had been so fine was in very poor condition. And on top of that, of course, there were the bombs. So to me, it's just a very interesting place, and that's where my detective hero gets sent to investigate a suspicious death.
Now, I asked you beforehand the correct pronunciation of your detective's name, because it is a name I haven't run across before. Would you help me out with this?
Yeah, it's a slightly unusual name. He's Detective Inspector John Jago. It's spelled Jago. And it's not a name in the sense, it's not a name I've made up. There are real people walking around whose surname is Jago. The reason why he has that name is that it's a Cornish name, so it comes from Cornwall down in the southwest of England, and it can be a surname or a first name. It's the Cornish version of James.
Oh, I see.
So just as people might have that as a name, he does too. The two reasons really why I chose that name. One is that I wanted the detective to have some kind of Cornish backstory, Cornish heritage, because my name is Cornish as well. And although I'm not born in Cornwall, I was born in London, but my ancestors all lived in Cornwall. And for all I know, probably spoke Cornish way back then, because my surname comes from a Cornish word. So I wanted him to have some sort of Cornish backstory, although the books don't dwell on that particularly. The other reason I wanted to use that name was simply because I like the rhythm of words, and to me, I wanted a detective whose name had a rhythm of Detective Inspector da.
Oh, interesting.
Da.
It feels right when you say it.
I think to have a detective whose name was Detective Inspector Frederick Entwistle or something like that it would lack that sort of magic rhythm. And so I decided, yes, John Jago would fit that rhythm that I wanted. And it would be unusual, of course, it would be unusual and memorable. But it does create a problem if you don't know, because people always think of Shakespeare, or often think of Shakespeare in Iago or Iago. And so Jago doesn't necessarily spring to mind, but that's how you say it properly.
Okay, well, so when we meet Detective Inspector Jago in this book, he's going through a bit of a career transition, is maybe a bit too strong of a word, but something new has come up for him. Can you situate us in where he is, in physically in London, and then also within this story?
Yes, in terms of his own job, he's a detective inspector in the London Metropolitan Police. And in the first few books, he's stationed over on the eastern edge of London. And Pimlico, of course, is in southwest London. So it's right across the other side of London. In the first few books, he's stationed in the east, though, because that's where the initial impact of the bombing was when the Blitz started in September 1940. That's the part of London that was hit the worst. In the east is where the docks were, the very important docks on the Thames. And I chose that as a starting place because that's where I was born and that's where my family is from. That's where my parents were at that time. But when I started these books, my hope was that they would become a series, because you never know if you write a book, you don't know if a publisher is going to want any more. So my hope was to write a series. And I also thought then, yes, that's good, because it then became a series. But I thought I didn't want to have a series where they're all happening exactly the same place, because it strains the environment. You can't find new locations within a small area and create a fresh context for each story. So I did think that at some point he would have to move further afield. And so I made sure, I think it was in the first book, but I included a very small detail which I'll leave readers to work out for themselves. But there was a small detail I included, which was my, if you like, escape route for him to move onto a wider canvas if the need should arise. And so in this book, he is actually sent to investigate a suspicious death across the other side of London. And there were lots of reasons, real reasons for this at the time, because the police force was under severe strain. I think at the beginning of the war, a lot of police officers had returned to the armed forces or had volunteered for the armed forces. So numbers were down. And then there was the extra responsibilities, extra duties they had to do their job in blitz conditions. There were extra regulations that had to be observed, many more emergencies that had to be attended to. And on top of that, of course, quite a number of police officers were killed on duty and off duty in the air raids. And so there was a very real reason for him to be called in to do a job on the other side of London, because there was a small force of detectives whose job was to be deployed by Scotland Yard, where the local police force couldn't quite cope with the extra work. So they would be, that of course is the classic fictional Scotland Yard detective who's sent here, there and everywhere across the world. But that of course was the real fact, that in many cases, particularly provincial police forces away from the capital, had hardly any criminal investigation department themselves. So they had to call in help from London.
It is a classic feature of a lot of film and television in the detective genre, that a Scotland Yard detective is sent to X place and has to sort of bed in with the local police force, of course. And it's interesting seeing it happen in London, especially knowing what I do know. And I think readers, especially readers of historical fiction and historical mystery, will have more familiarity maybe than the average person with the amount of bombing in East London and the devastation of the docks and surrounding areas. But of course, as you said, that wasn't exclusively contained to that area. And so it's interesting that the case that brings him to the western part of London, to southwest London, Pimlico, is one that actually does have a bomb connection to it. And that's because we find, of course, a body in an Anderson shelter.
That's right. Yes. And of course, there were strategic reasons why the bombing spread to other parts of London, because there were other strategic targets apart from the docks. So that meant there was damage to other parts of London. But also, I think there was simply the random consideration that if an enemy bomber arrived over English territory, and it was generally English rather than British, but other parts of Britain were severely damaged. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, severely damaged because of their own strategic installations. But there was the simple fact that if you were flying a bomber and you flew all the way here, and you couldn't find your target, you had to drop your bombs to make sure you had enough fuel to get home, because
Of course.
you were carrying weight. So a lot of bombs, I think, were just dropped randomly when the pilots and navigators couldn't find the target. So
It creates such fear for the people who are living there, of course, and then also leads to the need for places to shelter, regardless of whether people actually had viable places within their homes, right?
yes, there were two main forms of shelter. At the beginning of the war, there was the Anderson shelter, which was in your backyard. And if you look at one now, you'd think what a flimsy thing that was, because it's simply some corrugated steel sheets. And the idea was the government would provide these. If you earned more than £250 a year, which I think in 1940 would have been $1,000 a year. Mm-hmm. If you earned more than that, you had to pay for it. You had to pay a small amount of money for it. If you earned less than that per year, you got it free. But I think what happened was the local council would turn up with the materials on the back of a truck and drop them outside your house. And then all you had to do was dig a huge hole in your backyard. I mean, I don't know, what did you do? I mean, you'd have to, a lot of people would be fit and strong enough to do that. But if not, they'd have to enlist the help of neighbours or maybe pay someone to do it. So you dug this big hole, you assembled the parts, which was created a shelter. I think it was 6'6" long, 4'6" wide, and about 6 foot high. So not exactly huge, in which it was possible to shelter, I think, 4 adults and 2 children,
right,
living very close together. And then you assembled it, and then you could pile some earth on top of it. Some people, wanting to show their defiance, I suppose, did cover it in earth, and then they planted flowers in it to make it look nice. But I think really they were designed to protect you from blast, because there were regulations about how far away from your house you should build them. They had to be within a certain number of feet of the house, but not too close. But the reality then was that you might live in a house without having rent a floor of a house or have a whole house. And then in the event of an air raid, you were supposed to go to your shelter, which was maybe 10 feet behind your house in the backyard, just a thin bit of steel with some earth on top, and you shelter in that. Well, of course, sadly, in so many cases, many lives were saved because a bomb fell on the house, destroyed it, but the people in the shelter survived. But equally, that bomb could fall on the shelter. It's only got to land a few feet away. They're not laser guided. So sadly, a lot of people were killed when a bomb hit their shelter. And the alternative was to go to a public shelter. And in the early parts of the war, lots of shelters were built out on the street, which were bricks, like a brick square with a concrete roof on it. But these, one of the books goes into this, sadly, these didn't always stand up very well to blast. And so a bomb might land nearby, blows the walls out, a huge thick lump of concrete lands on the people inside and kills them. So it was very difficult. And later on, it's well known that later on a lot of people took shelter in the underground railway stations on the tube, so that was safer, but they had their disasters there as well. I remember my mum saying that I think in 1941, the government produced a new kind of shelter, which was like a steel cage that you put underneath your table in the house, and took shelter in that. So you were protected by the steel box you were in, steel mesh. And I remember my mum, who was a teenager at the beginning of the war, saying that she would get in this shelter, and she was desperately hoping that no one bit of her would be outside the shelter, because she's scared that if there was a foot outside this steel box, then she would be blown up or killed or whatever. So it's a nervous time for everyone, even in their shelters.
Absolutely. I just by coincidence was in the Imperial War Museum a few weeks back, and I was able to walk into one of the shelters. They do have one there. They also have that steel shelter that you've mentioned that goes under a table. It is small and it is claustrophobic, and I can't even imagine how challenging that would be for people to do that night after night, especially through the Blitz, which of course was, London was hit so often night after night. And in some cases, you mentioned day raids as well. Within this book, you have a lot of people with different opinions and attitudes about a lot of things. But one of the things that I think is most striking is people who choose to shelter in different ways, choose not to shelter. And then, of course, you also have the question of looting as well, which would be people going out either right after or during the air raids as well. When you were looking at these attitudes and doing your research around that, where were you finding information about sort of how people were thinking about this at this particular point during the war? And did you find that it changed from the time that you're writing about it in your very first book to your fifth book? I believe this is your fifth book. Is that right?
I think maybe it's sixth.
Maybe it's the sixth book.
Sixth.
My apologies.
Don't ask me. I don't know. Yeah. That question is one of the things that really intrigued me, because I'm trying to capture life as it was then, and obviously a big part of that is how were people thinking. But when you try to capture how people were thinking back then, you obviously depend on sources, both written and anecdotal, and it's very difficult to judge where the myth and the reality overlap and where they don't, because they're very strong. When I say myth, I don't mean made up stories, but there's very strong understandings of that period about how resilient people were in London, because they didn't give up under all this pressure and all this bombing. But on the other hand, it would be unrealistic to assume that applied to everyone. So how many people weren't like that? And what if people were finding it a real struggle? What were the things that were causing them to struggle? What was true, what wasn't? And there are some useful things. For example, I remember I looked at there was a thing called the Mass Observation Survey, which was a thing which someone had set up, and before the war, which was a sort of sociological study. They would go around asking people what they thought about various current issues. And I think the government saw the value of this when the war started, so they continued doing this. And these reports make very interesting reading, and quite a number of books have been written based on them, where their investigators would just go and ask people. They'd go into a pub or a shop or any place where just ordinary people were passing through or gathering, and ask them questions about, well, how are you finding the bombing? And so they would draw up reports based on these very mixed responses, and these would feed into the government's own planning. But the question of what people were thinking and doing, to me, I've drawn on a lot of sources, and on balance, I think I try to paint a picture where you can see the variety, you can see the range. So some people were risking their lives to go tunneling by hand into a bombed building to try and rescue someone, and at the same time there'd be someone down the street breaking into a bombed house to try and steal whatever they can find. And crime certainly didn't stop in the Blitz, and in fact it was quite a gift to the thieves, because there was the blackout, so everyone had to black out their houses at early in the evening, leave them blacked out at night, so there was no light, no artificial light to be seen by. It was a real advantage for people who go around stealing. But I think I try to draw on the way things were being reported at the time. So, for example, through old newspaper archives, because there you can get an impression of what things were on people's minds, or what things were people concerned about. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, I'd like to take a random example. People who like to make their own jam, they grow fruit. All you have to do is buy a load of sugar, but sugar was on ration, so they couldn't make their homemade jam. And so I think the government introduced a special ration, extra ration, that you could get if you could demonstrate that you did actually make your own jam at home. You could have an extra ration of sugar to do that. And those little tiny details appear in some degree in particularly local newspapers. But there were, at the same time, there was censorship of what went into the press. Understandable perhaps in wartime, we wouldn't accept it now, but for the sake of national security, then there was censorship. So when reading it, I read between the lines, if you like. You know, you can tell that something's not being talked about. So, for example, you might know as someone living in London at the time, if a bomb landed 2 streets away from where you live and it landed on a bus and killed 30 people, you'd know about it because everyone was talking about it. But if you were living somewhere else in the country, you wouldn't know about it because the newspapers were very coy about giving precise details. So they would simply say there was a number of bombs fell in the London area, one of which landed on a vehicle. I mean, they would report it, but without giving away any details about where it was, when it was, and who the casualties were, because they knew anything in the press would be picked up on the other side of the war and used to refine their own operations. So it is very interesting, I think. You know, I just, because I find the question of how much was propaganda and how much was truth and how much was rumor and how did people respond to it and how did people handle it? How did people cope with the thought that they're not being told everything that happens, so how can they trust? Which is a very topical issue nowadays. I mean, it's become a global challenge, isn't it? But it was a challenge then too.
I found the myth making around the Blitz spirit, as you say, some of it being absolutely true. People did extraordinary things and pulled together, and that's something that I've noticed as an expat living here is still very much part of the rhetoric of sort of the British spirit and the British character. But I find that the question of crime during the Blitz just fascinating. And there's a wonderful book that I'm sure you know. I think the name is The Secret History of the Blitz, that is really interesting and talks about some really terrible things that people did to each other during a really terrible time. So I think it's particularly interesting that you've chosen to set a detective series during this time as well. I don't know how much of the mystery within this book you want to get into for the sake of course, spoilers, but perhaps you could give us a little bit more detail of what this particular crime is and how that fits into what's going on during the war at this time.
Well, this particular crime is a body found in an Anderson shelter in the backyard of a house in Pimlico. And the context of it is, well, for one thing, it's almost this time of year. It starts in November 1940 on Armistice Day, which is in England, that's our Poppy Day, although I believe in the States it's May. You have your Poppy Day. I don't know, but
we have Memorial Day and Veterans Day at different times of year.
Yeah. So in this case, it's Armistice Day in 1940, which is when everyone would buy poppies and wear them, and we'd have 2 minutes silence. And one of the aspects of the book is that Jago wants to buy a poppy. He needs to get his poppy, and is frustrated in his attempts to do so, and finally finds a woman selling poppies. It was mainly women volunteers who would go out and sell the poppies. And here again, the question of the sort of propaganda and truth and reality comes in, because he finds this woman standing on a pile of rubble selling her poppies, and he's intrigued because she's standing on a pile of rubble, but she's not wearing shoes that are really suited for that. And in fact, the whole scene for me was just inspired by seeing a wartime photograph of a woman doing exactly that. And I looked at the photograph and I thought, well, she's very well dressed to be standing on a pile of rubble. And I thought to myself, and why would you be standing on a pile of rubble to do that? And she has a soldier, and she's handing a poppy to a soldier. And I thought, well, who took this photograph and why? And so on. So clearly, to me, it's clearly a posed photograph. And there's nothing wrong with that if it's posing something which is true. But it just made me wonder why. And so that's part of the story. Why is she doing this? Because it wasn't a natural thing to be doing, which is not to suggest that she is or is not necessarily someone inclined to murder people.
Right.
but the context, I generally try to take a given week and find out. I have my own idea of what the story's going to be, but I find out what's going on as well, and that can influence the story. And also, I like to explore through it a particular aspect of the world as it was then, in terms of what people did for a living, what was their job and so on. So socially, what did they do? And the socially interesting thing about this is that the victim was a keen cyclist. So he was part of the world of cycling, and recreational cycling still went on during the Blitz. There were plenty of people who were cycling for reasons of the Blitz. So boys, young teenage boys who were too young for the armed forces, they would some volunteer to be messengers. So they'd be riding their bicycle through the bombing to convey important messages to the fire service or whatever. And one of the stories has a character doing just that. But recreational cycling was still popular, and so part of it goes into this sort of, so who else was interested in cycling, and you gradually unfold another corner of society and how they were in this particular situation of the Blitz and being bombed. So does that answer? Does that give you enough flavour of the book? It's always difficult talking about a murder mystery.
I was to say, I imagine it's a very tricky thing getting the balance right between revealing too much and then, of course, wanting to give people a flavour of what it is that they can expect when they pick the book up.
Yeah, I suppose all I can say is that Anderson shelters, as I said earlier, were dangerous places to be, but there was more than one way in which they could be dangerous.
Yes, I think that's a very good way of putting it. I'm curious about writing a series that follows a detective throughout multiple books, and how much you had planned from the very beginning of this series. I know you mentioned adding a bit of a trapdoor or a way out to move your detective around London if you needed to, if you were fortunate enough to have the series expanded by your publisher, which of course you have been. How much of what you planned has come true throughout this book, and do you know much about where this is going next, multiple books down the line, or are you being taken where your detective takes you?
Well, one always thinks of J.K. Rowling and her Harry Potter books, where she says that she had the entire series mapped out before she started, and I think I don't have that. I certainly I start with the beginning and end of a book. But there are some aspects of the development of the core characters which I don't know the future for. Particularly, there's the interesting relationship that Jago has with a woman reporter. Mm-hmm. And people are always asking me about that, where's that going? And I think, well, I don't really know. Even with regard to an individual story, when I'm writing one of these books, I start, as I said, with the beginning and the end. But as I'm writing it, usually the murderer kind of changes, and I'm uncertain. And now I'm working on the next one now, and I think, I think I know who did it, but I'm not sure. And it may change as the story goes on because it builds its own world. Mm-hmm. And so I think with characters, I have the core characters, so I knew from the beginning would go on, because you have to have, if you've got the same detective all the way through, you need to have some core characters that he can take with him. But I don't have the whole story mapped out for the future, partly because I think if you set out by saying I'm going to write a series of 5, a series of 6, a series of 10 or more, you need to create the arc of that particular aspect of the story so that it ended on the book that you were going to end on. Yeah, I think that's unrealistic, because I certainly no one's telling me that there's going to be 10 books in this series or 20 books.
Right.
And so I prefer to see how it develops from story to story. Things happen and things move forward. Characters might come back, and I'm thinking at the moment about whether to bring back a character, because it's something obviously people ask me, are you going to bring characters back? I like that character, it's he or she coming back. And I always say, well, it depends on the story. If it fits the story and it's purposeful and it has a point, then yes. But generally speaking, I certainly wouldn't bring back a character for the sake of it. So any character's future is in question as they develop.
I think that makes it more exciting as a reader as well, because you never know what's going to happen, of course. Either, as you say, bringing somebody back, or we might say goodbye to somebody as well.
Yes.
Have there been any characters that have surprised you through the process? I know you mentioned those core characters that have been with you from or near the beginning of the series. Has anybody undergone a development or a character arc that you weren't expecting?
Certainly within a given book, yes, because I find that I start with creating the characters in outline, and then I start writing. And then when I've been writing for a while, very often I get to the point where I think, no, she wouldn't say that. She wouldn't react like that, because I know by then, I know the character better. I know how she ticks, what makes her tick. I know her outlook and so on. And so then the character begins to shape the story rather than the story shaping the character. And I really enjoy that, because I think this, again, keeps it a bit unpredictable. At the start, I know what sort of person this is. This is a 30-year-old driver who drives a truck and likes beer, whatever it may be. But then as the story develops, I discover something else about this character. That this character has a secret passion for beekeeping or something. And so this will influence who they are, and as they develop, so they start to influence the way the story can go. And I realized, no, I can't do this thing, because the character simply wouldn't do it. But they give me, and it's not sounding too odd, but I mean, in one sense, the character gives you an idea as you're writing it, because they begin to have their own life.
I'm very curious about the writing process, mostly because I'm a nosy person who wants to know more about what other writers are doing. You mentioned outlining character and working with those characters and how they can change and develop throughout the story and move the plot. When you're first starting out with a new book and you're facing that first blank page, what is the first thing that you typically do? Do you start with those character outlines, or do you dive right in?
I start with the body, as it were. I start, because they're murder mysteries, I start with a body. Where is it found? If it's found, and who was that person? So I start with that, and then I tend to go to the other end and think, well, how was that person murdered? Because that and the why won't really emerge, of course, until the end. And I find that beginning and the end, and then finding the journey from the beginning to the end. And I've always found that whatever I've written, not just these stories, I mean, to me, that's a principle. I need to know where I'm going. And some writers will say, no, I just think of a character, put them in a situation, and I see what happens. I write it and I see. And I don't do it like that. I'm what's more called a plotter.
I am as well, so I understand.
Yeah. And I find, from past experience, if I write a poem, I start always with the first line and the last line, and then find the journey from beginning to end. If I write a feature article, it's the same. What's a great opening, a great closing, and then the journey from one to the other. Even at one point in my life, I used to write direct mail letters, and exactly the same thing applies there. I was working for charity. So it might be like a fundraising letter. And in our case, we were working in international relief and development. So it might be writing an appeal letter because there's been an earthquake somewhere, or there's a war somewhere, or a famine or something. And so it'd be a matter of writing one side of paper. And the key thing was the opening and the closing, because with the opening, you have to grab your reader's attention. And with the closing, you have to resolve it by enabling them to do something. And there's a journey from beginning to end. And the key thing I learned then was that wherever else you do, don't let go of your reader's hand on the journey. Don't give them any hole they can fall down and drop out of it. And I think of it as, I regard it as not breaking the spell in fiction, because I find exactly the same principle applies in fiction. You've got to start well and finish well, and make the journey fit, make the journey not necessarily always comfortable, but it's such that you hold your reader's hand and you don't let go. And I'm not saying I do that perfectly, but that's what I try to do. Mm-hmm. So the development is about that, and I do tend to think through how we'll get from beginning to end, what the reader's journey will be.
I'm curious about something you said when you mentioned you start with a body, and not just who was killed, but where they were found. I'm so curious because your titles, I've just pulled them up here. The Canning Town murder, the Stratford murder, the Dockland murder, they're all very strongly connected to place. And I'm curious about the relationship between place and the process of writing as well. I know you mentioned for this series, you couldn't physically get to Pimlico because of the lockdowns that we experienced. How much does being able to visit a place and research a place play into those early drafts when you're writing and figuring out how this puzzle will all fit together?
Yeah, for me, it's essential. And with Pimlico murder, I did eventually get there, but I'd done a lot of research without being there beforehand. But what it meant was when I got there, I felt as if I'd lived there, and I looked around and I thought, well, I recognize this place because I've learned about it without coming. But actually walking the streets, to me, is really important, even though I'm writing about what it was like 80 years before. Mm-hmm. But that's because there'll still be things that you can see now that people would have seen then, places that would have been real then are still there now. And I think, to me, it's the feel of the place and the relative geography of the place. So if you if you were working in this part of the area, where might you live? And what would you see if you looked down that street? A case in point in the Pimlico murder would be when I think Jago and Detective Constable Craddock, his assistant, they arrive at one location in the story, and it's a street near the River Thames. They look down the street, and across the other side of the river, they can see Battersea Power Station, which is an iconic site in London.
Absolutely. I used to live in Battersea, so I remember that well, that view.
So the two things of location visiting and historical research come into play there, because for one thing, simple thing, I need to establish that it's reasonable to say you could see it from this place where I am, even though the road doesn't exist anymore because it's been redeveloped since the war, but I know where it was in relation to modern Pimlico. But to be sure that you can actually see something across the river, because if you were a little way further down the river, of course the river bends, so you can't necessarily see something. Mm-hmm. So I can't have a character looking down the river and seeing something which is round the bend in the river. The other historical research comes in because Battersea Power Station is iconic partly because it has 4 very tall chimneys. But it was built before the Second World War, and in 1940 it only had 2 chimneys.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I mean, they didn't build them all at the same time. So it's important to me to be there and to know that it is plausible to say you can see this, because nothing, again, it breaks the spell. I mean, if I describe something, and it's always a risk, I'm not saying I always get it right, but it's always a risk of getting it wrong. But I try really hard to avoid it, because if you know that area and I say something that is not physically possible, it breaks the spell because the reader thinks, yeah, he doesn't know. And in
Yeah.
fact, what pleases me, I get emails from people, from readers who say, you described that so well, because I was born there. You know, some reader even wrote to me once and said, I couldn't believe it when you said Jago went down this street and round the corner into that street, because I was born in that street, and that's right. And someone else said, I can't bear so-and-so's novels because they describe the character getting from one part of the city in question to another via a certain street, and I know you can't. And he said, that's why I shout, I can't believe this, because it's wrong. So I don't want to make my readers frustrated and shouting. I'd rather they thought either, yeah, fine, or if they know it, they say, yeah, that's right. And so I do like to walk the streets, and that will sometimes yield unexpected local history. So, for example, when I went to Pimlico to check that my location work was accurate, there was one place where there's a bridge that goes over the railway line, and on a map it's called Elizabeth Bridge. Mm-hmm. And I went there, and on the road sign on the bridge it says Elizabeth Bridge, but I wanted to feature as a location in my book, so that's going to be in the form probably of dialogue, where a character will say to another, oh, I live up near. So are they going to say I live near the Elizabeth Bridge, or are they going to say I live near Elizabeth Bridge? And I thought the only way I can find that out is to stand on that bridge and stop people as they walk by and say, excuse me, are you local? What do you call this bridge? At the risk of them thinking I'm mad, because they say, look, you can see there's a sign right behind you that tells you. But I did this. I went to this bridge and I asked one or two people, and they said, I don't know. I don't live here. I've not been here long. And I saw a lady coming along the street. So I just asked her, and she said, oh, yes, she explained it all to me. And she said, I've lived here for so many years, and my husband was born here, you know, and lived here during the war. He's died now, but I still know his stories. And she then basically took me, she said, well, do you know about this other street round the corner? That's a very interesting place. And she took me on a little guided tour of the area.
Oh,
and it was thrilling for me, because that is what usually happens. And the book that I'm working on for the next one, I did a research visit to another part of London for that. And I was standing in a place which had been rebuilt since the war, wondering about some location. And there was a couple of people walking a dog. So I asked one of them, and they said, oh, sorry, I don't know. And as I was about to give up, out of the corner of my eye, I saw an elderly couple standing just a few yards away, and they were looking at me. And they smiled, and I smiled back. And one of them said, excuse me, are you doing something like family history research? And I said, well, no, it's not family history, but it is research about the area. And they said, oh, well, perhaps we can help you, because, you know, I was born here in 1940 and lived here. My husband and I, we don't live here now. We moved away, but we come back every so often just to look at the old places. And I said, oh, yes, you can help me, you can help me. And it's so, I just love it. It's so exciting that so many people are very happy just to tell this complete stranger about local history. And that really helps to bring it to life, because you know, then I have the sort of detail which you don't find in history books. Mm-hmm. And there's so much of that. It's not even on the internet.
That's wonderful. And I think there's something about that in-person conversation that just makes all the difference sometimes. I'm curious, as we wrap up here, I would love to get your take on a question that I get a lot. And I know fellow authors who write in World War II get a lot, which is, what do you think it is that keeps drawing readers back to this era? What is the fascination with World War II in 2021?
I think it's the nature of the era, in that it was so intense. Ian Rankin, who writes the Rebus novels, he said something like, the best crime fiction these days looks at moral questions. It takes ordinary people and puts them in extraordinary situations and says to the reader, how do you think you'd cope? Mm-hmm. And I remember when I heard that, that really did inspire me in a way in writing these books, because I thought, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to take people because the people involved were ordinary people. It's like, my own parents, ordinary people, suddenly put into this extraordinary situation where all the lights are out every night, a siren goes, and the next thing you know, there's bombs falling all over the place. Everything's being blown up and set on fire. And you are pretty much defenseless in the middle of it as a helpless civilian. So, and your food is rationed. You've got to try and get to work every day. How do you cope with it? And I think people look back to that era because it was like nothing we've known since. And I felt even when we were experiencing the pandemic of COVID, I found for myself, I just reminded myself, this is grim, but it's been grimmer. And I felt, that helped me to put it all in perspective for me personally. And I thought, and I've always thought, I think all my life, whatever bad situations I'm in, that's nothing like what my parents had to face. No one's actually trying to kill me every day. And I think we would probably compare ourselves with that generation. I mean, sometimes it's called, both here, I think in your home country, referred to as the greatest generation.
Yes.
Because it is a time that seemed to reflect values of self-sacrifice and so on, and decisive action, and a clear distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, which we find inspiring nowadays because we feel maybe we've lost some of it. Although at the same time, I think I tried to counterbalance some of that because it can't be just a sort of naive romanticism. Absolutely. Because there were deserters, there were people who couldn't cope with the bombing, there were people who sat in their air raid shelter and just screamed hysterically because they couldn't cope mentally, and that's real life. So I don't want to make it into a romanticized vision, but I think that the reality of the pressure people were living under is an inspiration, and it's great fertile ground for fiction, I think, because you're able to put your characters into extreme situations, and that, to me, that's just really interesting.
I agree. I think you have something there. Absolutely. I like to make sure I ask everybody before they go for some book recommendations. So I apologize for putting you on the spot, but is there anything that you've read recently that you've really enjoyed, or any recommendations for people who maybe want to read some historical mystery set during the war or set during other periods that you think this is a good place to start?
Well, the place I started with crime fiction was years ago when my sister gave me a book, and it was one of Dorothy L. Sayers' Peter Wimsey books. I mean, I guess everyone's heard of them, and they are some better than others, but I think certainly for me they were a great start because I thought, I really like this, I really enjoy this, this detective. So that's one starting place, I think. To come right up to date, the most recent thing I've read, which I enjoyed, was a recent detective story by Lynn Truss. They called A Shot in the Dark. And I like that simply because it was quite tongue-in-cheek. It took the conventions of crime fiction and slightly subverted them. So those would be my first and last recommendations at the moment.
Wonderful. And are you able to tell us anything about what you're working on next and what we might see next from the Blitz Detective?
Well, I'm working on one, it'll be in London, in another part of London. And it's at a fairly early stage at the moment. And so I don't know that there's anything very certain and fixed that I could tell you really, except that it will be Detective Inspector Jago and his faithful sidekick Craddock.
Something is coming.
So it's probably too early to say very much about where it's going to go. I mean, I have in mind a location and I have a body, but what else happens? And I think I'm still looking at a particular time in history to draw out more ideas which I'll use for what happens in the story.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we'll have to keep an eye out. Is there somewhere that we should be following along with you online to make sure we get all the updates about when new books are coming out?
Yes, I've got a Blitz Detective website, which I'm just in the process. We're updating it, we're revamping it. And so I think it should be out probably by the time anyone might want to look at it. But it's just www.blitzdetective.com. Blitz Detective is one word. So that tells you a bit more about the Detective Inspector and the books, and keeps things up to date. And I have a mailing list, and I send out an email 3 or 4 times a year that tells people what's happening with the books, if there's a new one out and so on. And people can sign up for that through the website. So that's the main ways I do it. And I have a Facebook author page, of course.
Okay. Wonderful.
At Mike Hollow Blitz, I think, if I recall correctly. So people can certainly keep up to date through that Facebook page. And I think if you type in Mike Hollow author, you're bound to hit it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have all the best luck with your releases around this book, and that people enjoy the series. I know I certainly did.
Great. Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure meeting you and talking to you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us.